Orchids are some of the earliest examples of flowering plants. With over 28,000 species across the globe, the number of orchid species are more than twice the number of bird species, and nearly equal to the number of bony fish species found in our oceans. Here in South Africa, orchids are well represented in the fynbos, as well as in the summer rainfall areas of South Africa. Their flowers are often extremely modified to suit the needs of their pollinators, which ensure the survival of their future generations. Because of this, many of them have bizarre adaptations such as an elaborate lip or elongated spurs, which give them an almost alien-like appearance. There's no doubt that their flowers are unlike any others found in the fynbos. Not all flowers cater with nectar and pollen. Bees also need other ingredients to feed its young and build its nest. Oil. And there are some plants that have adapted to that and saw that gap in the market in order to cater for those specific needs. And this is one of them. This is Corycium carnosum, a monk's hood orchid. If you look at the flower, it doesn't look that attractive. It doesn't need to be that attractive because this flower is giving oil to the bees. When the bee flies through the meadows, it can smell that floral oil. We can't. As I sniff away, I can't smell anything, but the bee can. This flower is adapted in such a way so that the bee can burrow into the flower with its hairy front legs. As it does so, it scoops up all the oil with its hairy front legs. We usually see bees with little pollen sacs on their legs, but this one will have oil. Now, as it does that, it burrows itself in, and then the pollinia, the pollen, the male part of the flower, gets stuck onto its back. It flies out, visits another flower, and upon entering that flower, that pollen touches the female part, and so pollination happens. So you might ask, what is the purpose of the oil? Why does a bee need the oil? Well, the oil is there to feed the larvae of the bees. It's very nutritious. Not only that, they also use the oil to build their nests. This orchid is not the showiest orchid. And carnosum means flesh-like in color, which it kind of is. It's not an orchid that you'll see on your hikes very easily because it wants to be hidden away. It's not interested in the sugarbirds and the butterflies. But the gap it saw in the market to provide oil to an insect is quite remarkable and very successful for this species of plant. Dyza uniflora is the famous orchid we have here on Table Mountain and in some surrounding mountain ranges. Dyza uniflora is the emblem for so much of South African flora. But it's a big family. We have a lot of different Dyzas in Southern Africa, even here on Table Mountain. And on my way to look for this gorgeous red Dyza in flower now, I found its little brother. And it's just about ending its flowering time. This is Dyza longicornu. And Dyza, coming from the word, well, it was named after Queen Dyza with her very prominent fish netting that she presented herself to the king. And if we look inside this little Dyza, its common name is the drip Dyza, you'll see that it's very pronounced. It's almost more beautiful than its famous brother, Dyza uniflora. Longicornu, that it means long horn. Cornus meaning horn. And if you look at the back of the flower, you'll see it's got this weird shaped, long horn-like spur. This is called the drip Dyza because this is in the mist belt. Table Mountain is very famous for its curtain or veil that goes over the mountain. And that happens a lot. But that's essential to the plants, especially the dioecious that grow here on the cliffs, because that is the source of moisture during the dry times. So the condensation and the drip of the mist then seeps through the moss, and that's essential for the health of these dioecious. So although we're on our way to find its big brother, this little guy is just as special, just as unique, and in my eyes, even more beautiful. Sometimes we tend to miss these little wonders along the way to go and see the big bold one. But Dioecia longicornu has a very special part in the Dioecia family because it's just so exquisite in its detail. One of the very distinguishable characteristics of orchid flowers is that they are always bilaterally symmetrical, meaning if you bisect the flower from top to bottom, both sides will be perfectly symmetrical. Many orchids in the tropics grow epiphytically on tree branches in the forest canopies. However, here in the fynbos, almost all are terrestrial, meaning they grow in the ground like a bulb or a tuber. And these orchid tubers store food within the plant while it's dormant, and once the growing season has commenced, new pairs of leaves shoot out from the ground. When conditions are just right, the orchid sends up a flower spike, which not only captivates its pollinator, but hikers and botanists who stumble upon its beauty. It's minute, so Bathylina only makes one leaf and one flower during the season. Upon walking on your trails in the fynbos, it's quite easy to only notice the large plants, the in-your-face proteas and fynbos flowers. But if you look carefully, very close by, it's a snake, it will bite you. There's some very interesting flowers hidden right at your feet. And this is one of them. The first time I've ever seen them. It's an orchid. This is Bathylina ithiliae, or called the spider orchid. What makes this orchid so special is its size. It's tiny, but look at the flower, look at the leaves, it's minute. So Bathylina only makes one leaf and one flower during the season. So a lot rides on this flower to be successful and make seed so that it can have babies. If we look at the flower, you'll see all of this spider-like tentacles. There's a reason for it. It's a lip, actually, and it's modified to attract its pollinator. Now if I look at it, it looks like an anglerfish deep in the sea. And anglerfish has got those little lights in the dark to dangle and attract the fish. The fish are interested looking at it and they try to nibble on it, and then it catches them. Same here. It's almost sunset. The light is intense and this starts to glow. And so the long proboscis fly come and it's curious and then land on here, and so pollination happens. It's a huge flower for such a small plant, and an immense amount of energy goes into creating this flower that we kind of miss when we walk along. Another interesting fact about orchids is its seed. It creates an enormous amount of seed, millions of seed, but the seed are as fine as the finest dust you'll find. And the reason for that is that 99.9% of those seed will never germinate and will never become an adult plant. But just a few will happen to do that. The seed are very fine, meaning also they have no storage. A normal seed of another plant has some storage of nutrients with it. So when it germinates, it's got a bit of, morning porridge to eat and then grow. But the orchid doesn't. There's nothing. So in order for the orchid seed to germinate and have enough energy to become a juvenile plant, it needs to work together with a fungus. And the fungus provides the seed with its initial nutrients to become a juvenile plant. And then it can do so by itself once the leaf is formed and photosynthesis happen. Some of the orchids are very fungi specific, and if the right fungus is not in the ground where the seed fall, it will never grow. Some of them are a little bit less specific, and a lot more fungus work together with the orchid. It's another example of how plants, like this flowering orchid, has a hidden partner underground, which we don't see, but without that partner, it cannot be this beautiful. It can never survive. This is, again, just a gentle reminder of when you walk in the trails here in our fynbos, look closely and look at your feet too, because little gems like this are everywhere. And how unique and special is this one not? Orchids are one of the biggest plant family groups in the world. And here in the fynbos, we have our fair share. Now this is winter rainfall area, so most of our orchids are terrestrial growing, meaning that their roots are based in the ground. And one of the biggest terrestrial orchids we have is this. This is Bonitea speciosa, or called the green wood orchid. They occur all the way from the Western Cape, Azefontein, which is the west coast, right up towards Zimbabwe. So it's a widespread orchid, not very rare, but it's one of the largest, and it's one of the most impressive orchids that you'll find in the shrubbery. Orchids are an ancient group, a group that has intrigued growers from around the world. They're such beautiful ones, and orchid flowers are so oddly shaped. Those adaptations are there for a certain reason. They are there to attract the pollinator that would pollinate their specific flower. So when we look at the flowers of Bonitea, it's so sophisticated. Look at all the adaptations, all the little parts of it. It's almost like spiders climbing up a tree. Why is that? Each adaptation is there for a reason. That's to attract and make it easy for its pollinator to sit on the flower, drink nectar, and then also do its job, which is pollinating it. And the pollinator for Bonitea is the hawk moth. The hawk moth is the only moth with a long enough proboscis to push it right back into the flower to drink the nectar that's in this long spur. Its spur is right down at the middle and it's long. Now how does it attract the hawk moth to it? Firstly, Bonitea is quite shy during the day. It hides. It's green in color and it's in this shrubbery. Why? Because it doesn't want to attract attention during the day. It wants all the shine to fall on it during nighttime. And dusk, which is happening now, it's starting to show what it does. It sends out a perfume, a strong perfume, almost jasmine-like. But the darker it gets, the stronger the perfume goes. And it also flows with the wind that is breezing past us. The hawk moth is attracted to the flower and land on all these specialized bits of the flower, adapted especially for the hawk moth to make it easy to drink. As it does so, its head touches the male part of the flower, and this happens. The pollinia, or the pollen, the male part of the flower, attaches itself with a glue sac on the forehead of the hawk moth. The hawk moth notices, but is still too thirsty, and it visits the next flower, and upon doing that, the male part actually touches the female part, which is also sticky. It's called the stigma, and the pollen rubs off and gets stuck onto the female part of the flower, and pollination happened, and this flower can now set seed. Well, the hawk moth is finished drinking, but it realizes it's got some weird adaptation on its head and it irritates it. So it goes sit on little branches around the orchid and then scratches it off. So if you're close to an orchid, walking past it, you'll see little pollen sacs all over the place as the hawk moth scratched them off. It's a special relationship, and it took thousands of years to develop between Bonatia and one insect. So much energy is put into the design and the architecture of this flower, and the immense amount of perfume that it sends out, just to secure its future. And what this orchid does is quite remarkable. It takes mimicry to the next level. This orchid is pretending not to be a flower, but to be a female insect. Most plants attract insects and pollinators by having a gorgeous scent or interesting colors, or giving an insect, or an animal for that matter, a reward. But there are other plants that are more sinister. Plants with a bit more of a devious way to attract a pollinator. And this is one of them. This is Diza atricopilla. And what this orchid does is quite remarkable. It takes mimicry to the next level. This orchid is pretending not to be a flower, but to be a female insect. Diza atricopilla gets pollinated by wasps. So it's pretending that its flowers, which are so weird in shape, unlike any other Dizas, look like a female wasp. It's got the black markings at the top, which is so unusual, and that looks like flapping wings, and light in the inside. The male wasp is attracted by this shape of this female wasp, but that's not the only thing that attracts him. If I smell the flower, there's no significant scent whatsoever, but that's another deception of this orchid, because there are. It's a female pheromone, similar to that of the female wasp, and that attracts the male wasp. The male wasp would visit the flower in the hope to mate with the female wasp, and upon doing so, its thorax would touch the male part of the flower, which is holding all the pollen, the pollinia, and that gets stuck on the thorax. The male wasp tries to mate with it, but it sees it gets no reciprocation from the female. Later on, it gets frustrated and bored, and then fly off to another flower, which it's perceived to be another female. And upon doing so, that pollinia then rubs off onto the stamens, which is the female parts of the next flower. And so pollination happens. These flowers last long. To the touch, they are hard. That means they are sitting and waiting for the right pollinator to come. They don't go off very quickly, and that gives them a high success rate in pollination. As I can see here, we have many seed pods developing. It's such an unusual orchid, one that you don't see a lot. It grows here in these sea peach areas. And one of the only orchids and plants in southern Africa that use mimicry in such an extreme way of pretending that it's a female to attract the male. Sexual deception. Ferns. They have a rich history with people. We all love ferns, and they're always used inside our kitchen in hanging baskets. It's an easy plant to grow, and as we know ferns, we always associate them with water. They want shade and a moist condition to grow. Ferns have an interesting story. Ferns have been colonizing Earth long before butterflies and bees and birds. It's an ancient plant. They don't have flowers because they don't need flowers. They don't have to get pollinated by insects or animals to reproduce. If we look at the structure of a fern, we see that it has a strong midrib and the leaves are segmented. Why is it segmented? because where they grow, usually there are high rainfall. And if the water puddles inside, it might tear the leaf. So by being segmented, the droplets run down each individual segment and then drip down to the ground below. The new fronds that come out are so elegant and beautiful, and there are a lot of stories and designs around those leaves, and they're called fiddleheads. They're all twisty and turvy, almost like a snail's shell when they erupt, and that's to protect that delicate, fine and soft leaf inside. You'll see that a lot of the ferns have hairy scales, and that also protects the plant from animals eating it, because that irritation that it gives in the throat prohibits them and chases them away. Ferns are interesting in its reproduction because a fern's life cycle has two parts. The two life cycles are sporophyte and gamophyte. So the story begins with a mature fern like this. And underneath the leaves, you sometimes find coffee-colored dust. And that is the sporangia. And sporangia houses the spores inside. When the sporangia turns dark, they start to dry out. And then they burst open. And that releases the dust-like spores into the wind. And that is also where water is the most important element for a fern to develop. So once the spores are released from the capsules, the wind takes it, or the water, and hopefully they rest on a piece of moss like this. The moss is moist, and there's enough substrate in the moss for the spore to germinate, and that develops into a gamophyte. The moisture around the gamophytes are essential. The gamophyte has male and female parts, gametes. It holds eggs in the female parts and sperm in the male parts. That is released at separate times, and that encourages cross-pollination. The sperm flows out into the moisture that's surrounding the little gamophytes and swims into another gamophyte and fertilizes the egg. And once that happens, a little frond will form, and that is the sporophyte, and that is the emergence of a fern. This is Schizia pectinata, or the toothbrush fern. It doesn't look like a fern at all, and this must surely be the strangest fern in southern Africa, if not the world. Schizia, or the toothbrush fern, has opted out of the damp, moist streams with shady covers by the trees. Instead, it made its home out here in the full sun and poor soil. It has less competition here as it would have had in the streams. Schizia has lost its segmented fern-like structures, leaves that we recognize as a fern. Instead, Schizia, or the toothbrush fern, opted for needle-like leaves, almost like the restios and grasses growing right next to it. There's a reason for it. When the wind howls through this valley, it dries everything out, and these hard, pin-like leaves withstand the force of that wind, and also it doesn't lose a lot of moisture as it would have done with broad leaves. At the tip of each of these pin-like leaves is the spores. It's housed in these curved down structures that almost look like cockerel's combs or toothbrushes, as the name suggests. They crack open when they dry, and so the wind funnels right through them and takes the dust-like spores into the valley. Hopefully they find a moist little patch between grasses when the mist has been through the valley in the early mornings. And so the life cycle of the toothbrush fern will be the same as the ferns in the river. Again, this is how evolution have split one family into completely different looking plants, unrecognizable as a fern, but still the inner workings of a fern. In the next episode, we will showcase perhaps the most famous plant family in the fynbos, Proteas. There's so much more than meets the eye when it comes to these stunning South African beauties.